start. Hey, Council, I'd like to call this regular council meeting of April 19th, 2022 to order with adoption of the agenda. So I'm going to make that motion. Councilor Gillette, second by Councilor Brooks-Hill. All in favor? Motion's carried. Adoption of the minutes of April 14th. Someone want to make that motion? Councilor Gillette, Councilor Palmer. All in favor? Motion's carried. Any business arising from those minutes? Seeing none, I'll just go on to announcements from the mayor. I just want to let the community know that the financial guide is up on TalkRevelstoke. So if people want to have a chance to or want to take some time and have a look at that, it's there. You can make comments. Give us the benefit of your opinion. Moving on to item 9A, short-term rental business license amendment bylaws. Someone want to put that motion number 1 on the table, please? Councilor Palmer?
That business amendment bylaw number 2305 be adopted.
Seconder for that motion, Councilor Gillette. Discussion on the motion. Mr. Simon is here. If you have any questions.
Business license amendment.
Am I in the wrong place?
Is it not loading?
Oh yeah, you're gonna sign, you need to sign out and touch it. This icon is out, there's a lot to be desired.
So is that just what we talked about?
Yeah, this is the adoption of the third reading.
Yeah, this is, we've done all 3 readings now. This is just for adoption.
Yeah.
Okay. Any question, Councilor?
No, yeah, so.
You got it.
We've gone through this. I mean, I'm in favor, the bylaw itself, I'm not in favor of, because there are some things that I am in favor of, but the inequity I feel is not been addressed. So I'm not in favor of the bylaw. I'm not in favor of these issues, except for the enforcement issue, which I think was based on would have alleviated a lot, much of the discussion had been done on enforcement in the past. But anyway, that's my
Okay. All right. Any further, Councilor?
Yeah, I have already voiced my opinions as well, but I'll be voting in favor of this, given that we're already at this point, so we can't really go back.
Okay. Any other comments on the motion on the table? Seeing none, I'll call a question. All those in favor? Opposed? Note that Councillor Elliott is opposed. Balance of councils in favor. This motion has been adopted. Move on to item number 2. Someone want to put that on? Councillor Gillette.
The municipal ticket information system amendment bylaw number 2306 be adopted.
Seconder for the motion, Councillor Palmer. Any discussion on this motion? Seeing none, I'll call the question. All those in favor? Opposed? Motion's passed. Thank you. Moving on to item number 3. Councillor Gillette.
The fees and charges amendment bylaw number 2307 be adopted.
Seconder for the motion, Councillor Palmer. Any discussion on this motion? Seeing none, I'll call the question. All those in favor? Opposed? Note that Councillor Elliott is opposed. All right, we're going to move on to item 11A, UMBC, UBCM. Ms. Braun, would you like to make any comments on this, or can I get the motion on the table first?
Through your worship, go ahead and put the motion on the table, and I'll answer questions.
Okay, someone want to put that motion on the table? Councillor Gillette.
The submission of a grant application to the Union of BC Municipalities Strengthening Community Services funding stream for continuation of an emergency shelter pilot program operated by Community Connections Revelstoke Society be approved.
Seconder for the motion, Councillor Brooks-Hill. Discussion on the motion, Councillor Gillette.
I noticed in the report, thank you, Worship, I noticed in the report that the funding, this is an extension of funding related to COVID, and that the UBCM and the province expect us to find sustainable funding after this. I'm assuming that that strategy and that plan is going to be part of our housing action plan, poverty reduction strategy, some combination of both? I'd just be curious to hear about what that next step after this would be.
Okay, Ms. Braun, do you have a comment on that? The next
Yes,
step?
through your worship to Councillor Chalet, yes, we are including the emergency shelter as a component of our housing action plan going forward, as well as a poverty reduction strategy. That'll be key components of both of those.
Wonderful, thank you.
Okay, any other comments or questions regarding the motion?
Yes, just to try to understand, so we have a pilot problem, did Community Connections offer an emergency shelter last year?
Yes.
And how many participants?
I think it was in the report. I think we had, was it 45 total or 45 in the month of December? Ms. Brown, do you have those numbers just off the top of your head?
Not off the top of my head. I'm looking at the report quickly because it was prepared by our community development coordinator, but I believe it was fully subscribed.
Which means?
45, certainly a month sounds.
I see 33, on page 5, right at the top of the page, it says, "Your emergency plan funded. The data collected indicates significant demand with 33 individuals accessing emergency housing since opening in December."
Okay.
33 separate or 33?
33 separate individuals.
So that strikes me as a very, very, like, I mean, I'm on the streets daily, not in this, but I don't see 33 people.
This is not necessarily people that are living on the street. This is people that, whether it's through COVID or a breakdown in family or whatever, that needed emergency shelter. And so Community Connections had made a deal with a couple of the hotels and had rooms available that they're guaranteed all the time for them to utilize.
And is it increasing? I mean, where are we at? I mean, how?
I don't know whether that's a question that can be totally defined as far as whether it's increasing or not. Any comment, Ms. Brown?
Through your worship, yes, the point, one of the key outcomes of this first phase of the project, the funding we've had in place for the previous and existing year, was to actually document the issue of emergency shelter demand in the community. If you recall, we were looking at the provision of emergency housing a couple of years back, and there was some concern about how we would quantify that demand. So this is giving us the ability to do that. I don't have the full report in front of me yet as to how the first phase has ended up providing housing, but demand was, I mean, it was a fully subscribed program. And I think going ahead, we're expecting that to drop by half, given what's available in the next grant cycle. And we'll be monitoring that closely to make sure that the adequate provision for emergency housing is built into both poverty reduction and housing action plan.
Okay, thank you. Councillor Shaw.
Thank you, Worship. Further to that full report that you were referencing, because this doesn't have a lot of the details, this is a grant application. I'm curious, and just to follow up, I'm assuming that full report will be part of our poverty reduction strategy and or the housing action plan?
That is correct.
Okay, and if one of the metrics I'm really impressed by, just to comment on it, in the public consultation section on page 5, lower down to what we were looking at, I really appreciate seeing the difference in the average of nights used based on length of stay in the community, because that has been something that has been flagged by the community as a concern, that people who've come here for a short time are leveraging our resources rather than residents. So seeing that data is being looked at, so for part of that report, we'll be able to start seeing some of that information. I'm curious as to whether we're collecting any race-based data. This is something that I've seen in more work. The province has just put out a report looking at diversity and inclusion and how important it is to have that data to be able to see any systemic issues. And I'm curious as to whether we're looking at that yet.
Any comment, Ms. Brown?
Through your worship, I'm not aware of that particular metric being captured, but I will make a note of that and ask if that can be reported on in the next round of bringing this information to council. And yes, just further to your comment, it is interesting that the demand for the program has been largely coming from those residents who have been longer term members of the community. So I think that was a good point. These are not necessarily people arriving temporarily in town.
Yeah, it just helps us understand who's leveraging these services and what we're looking at. Otherwise, without that information, we're making up stories. As much as our population does tend to be overwhelmingly white and Caucasian and European descent, there is more and more diversity in our community. And by starting to look at that, I think we'll be able to understand it better.
All right, thank you. Any other comments?
So we're asking for
$120,000
roughly, $112,000.
Yeah.
And okay.
And they're going for a grant through UBC.
So for the second phase of the project, we were entitled to look for 50% of what we received in the first round.
Right, all right.
The intent being that the demand for emergency shelter due to COVID is lessening.
Thank you for that. Councilor Palmer, any comment?
Yeah, of course, this is for funding application, but it does sort of flag some of those issues around issues of emergency shelter. This is in addition to the women's shelter?
Yes.
That is correct.
All right, any other comments or questions? Seeing none, I'll call the question. All those in favor? Opposed? Motion's carried. Thank you. Moving on to 11B, someone want to put item number 1 on the table for me, and then we can ask questions. Councilor Sulz?
That a recommendation be made to the CSRD to allocate 1/2 of the PILT funds allocated to the Revelstoke and Area Economic Opportunity Fund annually beginning in 2022 to support core administrative costs for community economic development.
Second for the motion, Councilor Shalit. Discussion on the motion. Councilor Shalit.
Thank you, Worship. Just a quick comment that I do appreciate that the restrictions on grant funds and a lot of these dollars moving around, there seems to be some significant changes and shifts in allowance of administration costs to be part of that grant funding, which helps take it off the sides of desks and get done properly. As well as later on in the report, some of the shifts to changing how the reporting is. I'm grateful to hear they're asking for it only twice a year now rather than quarterly.
Okay.
It is absolutely amazing how much time those reports take when it should be done doing, like that time should be spent doing the work. So I really appreciate seeing that. Thank you.
I think it's
Okay.
the wrong one.
Any other comments, Councilor Ryan?
Yeah, so in the report on page 3, it talks about business retention and expansion resources. And I'm curious why the ambassador program is listed under that. That seems like something that should be funded through RMI money.
Ms. Braun?
Through your worship, yes. What we did, it is funded through RMI funding, but we included it in here because some of the key issues facing local businesses regarding the impacts of the pandemic related to retaining and recruiting employees. So the ambassador program, which is funded to basically provide a standard of training for all employees doing frontline tourism work, was shifted somewhat to become a tool for business retention or attraction and retention of workforce. So I included it here as an activity, but not necessarily with the EOF funding.
Okay.
Okay, thank you. Councilor Palmer?
So for 2022, and if I'm understanding, this is for the 2022 year or 2023?
2022.
Okay, and then so Economic Development Commission have $25,250,000. Do we have a breakdown of how that funds is distributed?
$250,000, you're talking about the PILT funding that forms part of our core CED budget?
Yeah, looking at the allocations on page EOF, City of Revelstoke CSRD Area B allocation.
I see, okay, yes. So I provided you with a full breakdown of what we have received from the EOF in previous years. And in red is highlighted the amounts we're asking for this year. We're intending to access in the EOF. In terms of how it's distributed within the CED budget, that would be contained in the budget information because along with taxation, the CSRD funding composes part of our core budget.
Follow-up, Council?
So I guess I'm just a little bit, so we're approving this funding for 2022, but essentially we're like a third of the year through. So we've already committed some of these funds, I'm gathering.
That's correct. We have an agreement in place with the CSRD. Previously to this, it was a 5-year agreement that provided a lump amount per year. The last 3 years, we've received a lesser amount per year, a larger amount for a lesser number of years. So we're moving to a larger allocation that's tied or pinned permanently to the PILT, so that we don't have to come back year after year with a revised amount, so that we grow along with the PILT fund itself.
Okay, so I know that in the years, there was a 5-year, it looks like that ended in 2018 of 77,400 for Economic Development Commission. So it looks like there must have been a 5-year agreement back
Yes.
then, right? And then in 2019, it shows 3 years, 495. That's for
165,000 per year for 2019, 2020, and 2021.
Okay. And then this one is for 2022.
And going forward,
That full amount.
yes.
Okay.
So we don't know exactly what that amount is. It doesn't come in until, I think, July at some point. So the intention is to have an ongoing, rather than coming in with an ask for 5 years or 3 years, is to have it pinned to the amount of the PILT every year, so that fully 50% of the PILT is forwarded when it comes in July to the city for the CED core budget.
Okay, Councillor Ruth.
Does that have an impact on tax, like our tax burden? Like,
It does, in the sense that the CED budget hasn't registered an increase in the 4 years.
in the 4 years, in the past previous 4 years, or the forecasted? next
So the 4 years that I've been here working with the city, we haven't increased our CD core budget. We've been able to cover our increased costs and grow capacity and fund the development of our new space through other sources of funding other than taxation.
Okay, and do you anticipate that will continue if this new allocation is approved?
Yes.
Great, thanks.
Councillor Paul.
So and just further to Councillor Ryan's comment, so everything Revelstoke shuttle services feels like tourism predominantly as well. Just any comments on that? I'm good.
Through your worship, are we, I understand we're talking about recommendation 1. Are we going on with conversation about the whole report?
Yeah, fair enough.
Yeah, we'll come back to that in a bit.
Yeah.
Thanks. Councillor Charlotte.
One comment on number 1 was the accountability. And thank you, Councillor Brexell, for pointing out the biannual versus quarterly reporting is in a later tab as well with the RMI. With accountability on some of these projects, because the goals align with the CSRD, and this is where a city of Revelstoke can really support the CSRD in those common goals. With the increased budget for administration, I remember you speaking in the past about the CSRD and their communications role in that organization. Is there a communications person in the CSRD? So one thing I'm starting to look for is the communication strategy part of any report. And how are we going to communicate? Who are we communicating to and with? Who are our colleagues? And what information are we sharing back and forth? So going back to that idea of internal communication as well as external communication, that marketing function. So I'm curious to hear on the administration side, the accountability side, is what partnership or alignment is there planned with the CSRD's departments?
So this
Through your
one
worship.
will weigh in, I think, because you've spoken with Director Brooks Hill and,
Right.
and Jody in CSRD.
Yes, through your worship to Councillor Shirley. We have tried to improve communications. As you may recall previously, during the 5 years of that initial contract that was in place when I started with the city, there was very little communication with the CSRD. We have made a point of going to the CSRD at least twice a year and doing a presentation so that we can share with them some of the outcomes of the funds that we receive. We talk about for instance, the RMI funding benefiting about 50% of it is spent in CSRD area, Crown land. We talk about we reported a number of times last year on the recovery efforts that we were working on with our commission, and we have another presentation planned for Thursday of this week to give them an update on what we've been doing for the past 6 months. We haven't been there for 6 months at this point. So in terms of public communication, there is that. With communication directly to residents of the CSRD, that's been a bit limited. It's been rolled into communications we provide through the city, whether it's relating to a specific project or activity. We did last year send out directly to 500 residents in the CSRD some communications around our community wellbeing survey, and that was a first for that as well. As well, part of our ECDEV strategy that will now be able to move forward now that we have an OCP in front of us that will kind of guide that. There's lots of activity built into that around communicating the outcomes and the objectives of our CED strategy over the next few years.
Okay, great, thank you.
Any other comments on the motion on the table? Seeing none, I'll
Oh,
call.
actually, I do have a question. Sorry, on the report, there's also a comment about ongoing matching funding for food security role. Could you refresh my memory a bit about what that looks like in terms of how much of it and how that role is currently paid for?
Yes, through your worship to Councillor Rind. Currently, the city out of taxation allocates $10,000 per annum to the CSRD, or sorry, to the food recovery role, which is part of Community Connections team at this point. And so food security, we see that increasing. As you've seen, we've brought forward requests for funding to build, for instance, incubator kitchen, or to develop renew our strategy for food security, which was last done in 2014. So along with those kind of one-off project focuses on providing kind of infrastructure funding for the incubator kitchen or renewing the strategy, this would allow us to match the amount that taxation provides to that role with CSRD funding. So the increase from our previous budget of $165,000 going up to roughly $250,000, some of that increase will be allocated to match the city's taxation grant.
Okay, awesome, thank you.
All right. Any further questions on the motion on the table? Saying none, I'll call the question. All those in favor? Opposed? Motion's carried. Thank you. Someone want to put item 2 on for me, please. Councillor Shaw.
That a recommendation be made to the Columbia Shuswap Regional District Board to allocate $75,000 from the Economic Opportunity Fund to the Revelstoke Accommodation Association, Tourism Revelstoke, to support the implementation of the Destination Management Plan.
Seconder for the motion. Councillor Elliott. Discussion on the motion. Ms. Braun, you want to weigh in a little?
To your worship, just to say that we have brought this forward to council as a presentation with Megan Tabor of Tourism Revelstoke and Jamie Mays, our EDO, and we are including some of this information in another presentation to the CSRD this week. And essentially, the first round of funding that the Tourism Revelstoke has sought out for implementing the destination management has been received. I'm not sure that we're able to publicly announce that yet, but as part of that, there was a matching request made that the community contribute $75,000 to implementing the strategy. So that's where this would come from.
All right, thank you. Any other questions or comments? Councillor Ryan.
Yeah, doesn't the RMI funding, wouldn't this go towards the destination management framework?
The destination management framework is an initiative that will be led by Tourism Revelstoke. It's not specifically allocated to projects. It's essentially shifting the entire way that tourism is done in the community, from destination marketing to destination management. So there are different goals. If you recall from the presentation, I believe it's linked in here, that, it's linked to the Committee of the Whole presentation we gave in October. And it is a shift with a focus on sustainability and resident empowerment. And that transition will allocate funds to how we manage instead of just marketing tourism.
And this is not an ongoing cost, this is a one-time thing to do that shift?
That's correct.
Okay, thanks.
Any other comments? Seeing none, I'll call the question. All those in favor? Opposed? Motion's carried. Thank you. Someone want to put number 3 on for me, please. Councillor Charlotte.
The recommendation be made to the Columbia Shuswap Regional District Board to allocate $115,000 to the ski shuttle service for the 22-23 season to accommodate expansion planning.
Seconder for the motion. Councillor Brixell. Discussion on the motion. Councillor Charlotte.
Thank you, Worship. So I'm assuming this is tied in with the BC Transit presentation that we just received. Is this intending to combine the shuttle service with BC Transit for next season then?
So your worship, not at this point. Director Black could perhaps speak to that. That is in the works. There's discussion happening right now with BC Transit to amalgamate the two services. But no, this is to secure funding for the next season. So the 2022-2023 season. We find that the cost of the running the shuttle are running between $150,000 and $180,000 per year. And of that, about 1/3 is billed to one of the funding partners, RMR. Sorry, correct, I'm mistaken in that. The the city's share is between 150 to 180,000 per year. And in addition to that, we are billing RMR for their 1/3. So this 115,000 will go towards covering next year's service. And there is a portion as well that is partly covered by tourism.
Okay, Councillor Ryan.
When I read this, it seems like the report is recommending that we spend 1/3 of it, that we cover tourism Revelstoke's portion. Am I reading that wrong?
No, that's correct. We had previously been using our MRDT money to cover the share for the employer, the hotels, the accommodators, until we were told by the ministry that that was no longer allowable expense.
Okay, what about the revenue that they generate at the visitor center? What happens to that?
That those funds go to support the cost of running the visitor center and the chamber staff.
Yeah, and is RMI funding eligible for this?
Yes, we can also use RMI funding for the shuttle service or EOF funding. So I'm proposing that we start to think about shifting some of the cost of running the shuttle to EOF, which would allow us more freedom and flexibility in how we allocate RMI monies to city infrastructure projects, for instance.
Yeah, I see the intent, but it seems that EOF funds are more flexible than RMI, and therefore I do not think, like, I won't be voting in favor of this. I think this is definitely something that should be covered through RMI funds, and the EOF, which benefits more locals and is more broad in its ability to sort of impact all residents and visitors. I think we should be trying to protect that if that's possible.
All right, any other comments or questions? Councillor Bergstrom and Councillor Elliott.
I'm just curious, what would happen to the funds in the case that BC Transit takes over the service before the start of the season? You know, obviously it might not happen, but in theory it could. Oh, I see Mr. Black.
Mr. Black, any comment?
Through your worship, I can be almost 100% sure that the amalgamation of systems will not happen by fall, as we do need to procure new equipment. There's also going to be the agreements between a private partner and a public partner, BC Transit and the shuttle service, which is going to, I believe, going to be the first one in the province. And so it's going to take us some time to work through the legal agreements with BC Transit and the city in order to make that happen. We're hopeful that we can get into the system and get those tools and pieces pushing forward for the year after this. And so I hope that addresses that question.
Thank you, appreciate it. Councillor Elliott.
Well, it's been a long time. We've asked for quite some time a better arrangement with BC Transit. It's unfortunate that it's another year away. It sort of sticks just another kid. So anyway, but I just wonder about the escalation in prices. Years ago, it was 3 partners providing money for the shuttle bus. Right. It was the resort, the tourism, and the city. Right. So now we're taking over the resort, and now the city is taking over the 2/3 portions. Is that what I get?
Ms. Brown, do you want to just confirm, please?
Through your worship, it still is a three-way partnership with RMR paying 1/3. The city is now paying 2/3, but the expectation as captured in our contract, our contribution agreement with Everything Revelstoke, is that tourism provides alternative matching amount in event funding for the city. So we're able to leverage more funding from MRDT funds to support events and other kinds of tourism activities, whereas we cannot use MRDT funding for funding the service. The EOF, on the other hand, is specifically allocated. If you go back to the 2007 documents, one of the things it does is it talks specifically about transportation being a key service that they had envisioned the EOF supporting. And given that getting more people onto the shuttle service and using it to get around town, not just to the resort, is one way to reduce our carbon footprint, it seems to make sense that we shift some of these to the EOF fund while still retaining our ability to match it from the RMI if needed. But the truth is, we just don't know as we kind of work through, as Dr. Black pointed out, a new model of operating the shuttle service in future. We're not sure what that looks like. My intention is to find a way to allocate the funds to other sources other than taxation so that we can keep our head above water, still provide a strong service, and have the resources in place to shift to a different funding model in the future.
All right, thank you. Do you have a follow-up, Councillor? And then I'll go to Councillor Shulett.
Well, it's great that we're finding the most flexible way to use money from the EOF to amplify, to build our economy and find events and things that will add some spice to our life, to our community. Those things are good, but I'm just wondering, are the costs escalating? We've gone from 75 to 150, or I'm not sure what the rates have gone up, how they've gone up each year.
Ms. Braun, do you have any figures regarding escalation of costs, equipment, that sort of thing?
A good deal of escalation in costs was covered by the report that is linked to this about the shuttle. I apologize if it's not linked to this. I don't know if it is linked to this, but costs have gone up in the last few years, at least that I've been with the city, year by year. And part of it is increased demand for the shuttle. On the other hand, we've seen revenue drop because of COVID over the last 2 seasons. We've seen the shuttle shut down early because the ski hill is shut down early, and there are still costs covered that we are required to cover as per our contract with the shuttle provider. So it's a number of different factors that have caused costs to go up.
All right, thank you. And Councillor Shulett.
Thank you, Worship. From what I'm hearing, then this shift from towards RMI money and MRDT money towards EOF money, especially if one of the key strategies is around transportation, and if our long-term goal is to shift the shuttle service into our BC Transit service that we are also contributing towards. Is it your idea or vision for this then, by shifting to EOF funding long term, then that funding should be able to be rolled into supporting our transit system in the community?
Yes, that's exactly correct. One of the intentions was to still have the ability to use our tourism funding to support the ski shuttle service specifically. However, the EOF funding has been used in the past to say support the air service, which was not funded by RMI. So you'll see under the next resolution, we're looking at reallocating those previously committed funding to this as well. So shifting from an air service to a more reliable shuttle service. There's lots of ways we're talking about expanding the shuttle service. One could be more reliable transportation, for instance, to the airport in Kelowna. So the air service didn't work out because over half the flights were diverted back to Kelowna. So one of the intentions is to put in place a more reliable intra-city, inter-airport service that will move people around, reduce our carbon footprint, and encourage visitation without the extra costs of car economy.
Awesome.
Thank you very much.
All right, any further comments on the motion? Councillor Ryan and then Councillor Palmer.
Yeah, you had mentioned, Ms. Braun, that the intent was to use other money than just taxation, but in this case, there are other funds available, which is RMI money, and I do hear the benefits that you're suggesting, but I would encourage council to consider that this is money that can otherwise be spent on things that are not as rigid as RMI dollars. And this is a great example of something that if we spent RMI money on, then it benefits both existing residents and visitors, while also leaving the EOF funds to do more than just focus on visitor experience.
Okay, thank you. Councillor Palmer.
Excuse my confusion. I'm just slightly confused on, well, not confused, the part that I'm not understanding. So this is for the recommendation to the CSRD for allocation of funds. Has a decision already been made on the EOF funds that is within the city allocation of those funds? Are they tied together?
I'm not sure I follow you, Councillor Palmer. This request is going to, once it's made by the City Council to the CSRD, it is actually going to the CSRD on Thursday of this week. And so in order for EOF funds to be allocated to the city, it requires approval of council and the approval of the director for Area B, Director Brooks Hill.
Okay.
So in essence, this same report will be in front of the CSRD on Thursday for their consideration with council's recommendation.
Okay, so this motion is not just the CSRD's, well, that's the city of Revelstoke is integrated in the 75,000 as well, because it's a part. Okay, good.
All right, any other questions?
Yeah,
Councillor.
So in essence, we're going to be stuck with a BC Transit agreement. It's going to come up in September again for another year.
Mr. Black, you want to confirm that's correct?
That is correct, and I will be coming back to council likely in the next regular council meeting to bring the annual operating agreement for 22-23 for council's consideration.
All right.
So part of the discussion we don't have, I see the BC Transit bus on the highway quite often, and there are not a lot of users on that bus, but it's going at least once or twice a week out of town. And I'm wondering if that's part of the discussion we need to get involved in. I mean, it's a BC Transit bus it's from the city of Revelstoke. It's on the highway going to Vernon, Kelowna, whatever.
Yeah.
And I'm sorry.
It's the medical bus.
Yeah, that's just a luxury that maybe the taxpayers, I don't know. It's just a discussion. It needs to be put on the table.
Yeah, so we'll bring that up when we have those discussions. Okay, any other discussion on the motion on the table? Seeing none, I'll call the question. All those in favor? Opposed? No. Councillor Ryan is opposed. Motion is passed. Moving on to number 4. Someone want to put that on the table, please? Councillor Charlotte.
The recommendation may be made to the CSRD to reallocate funds previously approved for the air service in the amount of $85,741 to the ski shuttle service for the 21-22 season.
Second for the motion, please. Councillor Brooks Hill. Discussion on the motion. I'm just going to, so Councillor Palmer, I'll come to you in a moment. So just for clarification, Ms. Braun, I think you've already spelled it out in your previous conversation. Cost us 180 grand to run that ski shuttle service. So you're asking for allocating these other funds to bump up that 115 so that we have enough to run the service. Is that correct?
That is correct.
All right, thank you. Councillor Palmer.
Yeah, so just a sort of general comment on this motion and in the previous motion is this understanding of what we're doing with the transportation. So we've had the report from the Director of Engineering on the transit, the merging of these two. Right. So just for clarity, we're doing this for the 21-22, which is an interesting after the fact statement, I think. But if it's 21-22 season only, not for the following season. So this is not setting an expectation for following years.
Through your worship, what we've done here is in the 2021-22 fiscal year, there was already 85,000 of EOF funds allocated to the flight service for the final year of the contract that ended early. So we're asking that they reallocate that to the current season. Yes, of course, the shuttle stopped running yesterday. It takes a few months to get the final costs done and maintenance on vehicles, storage of vehicles, that kind of thing. So we are expecting to have invoices coming in at least in that amount. For the next fiscal year, the next season of the shuttle for 2022/23, we're looking at 115,000 of new EOF money being allocated to that. And that should get us through the next season comfortably so that we don't have to necessarily dip into our RMI funding. It also kind of puts things in place so that when we do transition to transit, we have a model of funding to contribute to the cost of transit. We anticipate that with, as you noted, the empty buses going around town, the shuttle buses, however, are fully subscribed. And often people are left waiting on the street and they can't get onto the shuttle buses. So we're hoping by combining them that it will be more cost effective. There will be better use, more efficient use of the buses themselves. And we will be able to use EOF funds to subsidize the cost of running transportation for all people within the community, not just to the ski hill and back.
Follow up, Councillor?
Yeah, so then the expectation is this is setting a trend of using EOF funds in the future. That's what I heard. And the other question, so this is for expenditures that have already happened in the past. So hypothetically, if this isn't adopted, how are those funds being paid for?
RMI funding.
That's coming from RMI and that's already approved?
Yes.
80,000?
Yes.
So maybe is the 85,000 RMI funding? It is already our RMI funding.
We already have RMI funds allocated to cover the ski shuttle for this season. However, we haven't had the final invoices come in yet to tell us what the full cost will be. There's a number of variables that impact the cost of running the shuttle each year. So we do have the majority of funding covered for the current season, but this will give us some room to not dip into the new allocation of RMI funds coming towards us, as well as allow us to perhaps reallocate some of the existing RMI funding to some short-term events that are coming up this spring and summer before we have the new RMI funds in place. And that'll be brought to the TIC committee. It was mentioned the other day at the meeting that we had that you were present at, Councillor Palmer, and that'll be coming back to the TIC in a few weeks.
Okay, Councillor Palmer, do you have a follow-up to this comment?
Yeah, I'm just trying to get it clear in my mind. So the funds, this $85,741 that was approved EOF funds for air service wasn't used probably appropriately. And now the request is for it to fund for this 21-22 season instead of RMI funds.
Correct.
And so and then that $85,741 that was RMI funds, if this is approved, what's that money going to be used for? Is that already, and again, this is hindsight, or is that being carried forward?
It can be carried forward as part of the new RMI. It could also be allocated to some expenses in the near term that RMI usually covers, such as events for, say, Indigenous Peoples Day in June, that may be requested of us before we have an RMI contract in place. And I would say, finally, we don't know what amount will be actually left until we get the final invoices from everything Revelstoke, and we know what the cost of running the shuttle was for this current season.
Okay, Councillor Gillette and Councillor Lynn.
Thank you, Your Worship. The short term, I just want to speak in support of this. I think that keeping transportation funds for transportation purposes makes sense. And then having transportation funding come from the CSRD in the city of Revelstoke with support. I like the partnership with RMR still, but really kind of reconfiguring that part of our relationship to make that part of our transportation infrastructure. When it comes to events, I think there's a huge opportunity this summer for some events in our community, start bringing people back together again, and then freeing up that RMI funding for those events, I think would be really beneficial for the community, especially as we recover from this pandemic.
Councillor.
Yeah, I just gonna, third time broken record, voice my frustration with this, because I think when I think of RMI money, and I'm not always the most like positive on these. I know it's amazing that we get this money, but it also helps the sort of like, I mean, it's not the reason that it's so unaffordable to live here, but it promotes that a little bit. And it's amazing that we have that resource, but it does mostly go to infrastructure that does require us to then maintain that infrastructure. And we don't have a lot of flexibility in the administration. They don't allow for a lot of administration, but EOF actually does provide for that cost to be borne or to be covered by EOF funds. And so instead of just trying to stretch these RMI dollars that are really focused on tourism and people that are visiting Revelstoke, I think we should be doing the opposite and protecting the EOF funds that can be used for both. And transportation is a really good example. Like, we're always looking for, okay, what RMI projects can we possibly do that benefit both existing users, but also visitors, right? That's like well, in my mind, that's at least one of the objectives. And transportation is a perfect example of that. right? Like, if we have good transportation, it's gonna benefit our residents. So I don't know why we wouldn't just use RMI money for that and use EOF funds for things like, I don't know, you go back and look at that list that was provided in this report, like the tech strategy, the associations that apply for money, the air service, other things like that are for administration, or economic commission, like the actual department that's able to administer it. Like, what? I don't get it. Anyways, I'll shut up.
Thanks for the comment, Councilor Burke.
Through the chair to Ms. Braun, if this 85,000 didn't go to the shuttle service, what could we use it for?
Ms. Braun.
Through your worship, there's a number of anticipated projects coming up that we'll be looking to the UF fund to help support. They're on that budget sheet that I shared with you in red. So as well as destination management, some planning for industry sectors that are experiencing transition in the coming months or years. Yes, and so there's other uses. Once we have allocated the items in red that are on the budget, we will still have a remaining amount in the UF fund of $565,000. Typically, if you look back to past years, other groups come forward that we've tried to shift towards providing some ongoing core maintenance funding for groups like the Nordic Centre, the Cycling Association, the Alpine Club, especially like the Revelstoke Cycling Association and Alpine Club, which don't have a business model that provides some revenue, unlike the Nordic Centre or the Snowmobile Club, for instance. We, as you can see, provided $50,000 to the Incubator Kitchen last year. We don't have a list of projects on the near future timeline yet, but I expect it would look not unlike previous years. I'm not sure if that answers your question.
How do organizations access EOF funding? Is it an intake, or is that a process through that they have to go through with your department? What does that look
It's an
like?
application process. So the applications would come to the CSRD. The CSRD shares them with CD. We discuss with the director of Area B, David Brooks Hill. We come to council for their recommendation and support, and then it goes to the CSRD for their approval. So there is a bit of a process to go through, and it does in one way it is more flexible. Another way it's more limiting. It's what might be harder, for instance, to fund things we have in the past in the city, like the skateboard park or the splash park with EOF funds. Those are better suited to RMI funding. So city infrastructure projects that support our Parks and Rec management plan are probably better suited to the RMI funding, and things like transportation that show a clear economic benefit are in some ways better suited to the EOF funds.
Great, thank you. Councilor, follow-up?
Yeah, that was a great overview, and it does, I can see how some projects would fit better through RMI, but I do still think that at the end of the day, this $85,000 is either going to go towards RMI, aka tourists, or EOF, aka all of these local organizations that you just mentioned: Alpine Club of Canada, Nordic Centre, Revelstoke Cycling Association, Air Charter, whatever, Revelstoke Golf Course, you name it. So, like, to me, that's an easy decision. It's not going to go to the tourists like that, but that's just my opinion. So I won't be voting in favor of this.
Councilor,
Yes, so I'm sorry, the RMI is tourism infrastructure. It means facilities, the Nordic Club. It's a benefit to the entire community. It's not just going back to the tourists. It's building our lifestyle. So the lights at the Nordic Centre, for instance, or the Snowmobile Club, those are benefits to Revelstoke. So pitching RMI funding as going back to tourism is maybe a bit narrow.
Yeah, fair enough. I do still think, though, that infrastructure requires maintenance. That maintenance is not always eligible through RMI, so that ends up being a tax burden. So
It's just like a bike path. If we build trails, you're gonna have to maintain them. So
Sure.
whether we don't build the trails, it's a call we'll have to make. So we can live with what we have, but if we want to build a future, we've got to change.
all right, so any further questions on the motion on the table?
One more comment, if I may, through your worship.
Ms. Braun.
Oh, sorry, one more comment. I was just going to provide some clarity. Yes, one of the changes in the new RMI program is that we are able to use RMI funds to support maintenance and ongoing costs for an amenity that was originally funded by RMI funding, so that we do have a bit more flexibility that way. And the second point I was going to make is that when we allocate funds to the Nordic Centre or the Snowmobile Centre, for instance, we are not on the hook for maintenance of those facilities as they're outside of the city. And so the EOF and the RMI can be used in combination to both fund a new project and to provide some ongoing core maintenance too. So it's a matter of balancing the program's objectives with the needs of the recipients.
All right, thank you. Any other comments? Seeing none, I will call the question. All those in favor? Opposed? Note Councillor Palmer, Councillor Ryan are opposed. This motion is passed. Moving on to number 5. Someone want to make that motion? Councillor Charlotte.
That a recommendation be made to the CSRD board to allocate $125,000 to the Community Economic Development Department for the City of Revelstoke and CSRD Area B to facilitate industry sector development planning.
Seconder for that motion, Councillor Ryan. Discussion on the motion. So, Ms. Braun, do you want to elaborate just a little bit on this, please?
Yes, through your worship, and I may actually have your worship elaborate as well, since you have been privy to some of the conversations happening with regards to impending changes to some key industry sectors in the community. So we know that there's transition, we're going through a transition with regards to forestry, and we want to ensure that we are at the forefront of identifying opportunities to grow and to shift and to transition and to support emerging economic opportunities in the community. And so in partnership with First Nations, with FLNRORD, or what formerly was FLNRORD, the Ministry of Forests, and the Ministry of Jobs, Economic Recovery and Innovation, we're looking for an opportunity to get out ahead of that discussion with the province, position ourselves to be able to respond through diversification, shared stewardship of our forests and water resources in our land base, and recognizing the long-term economic sustainability of our community.
I think you've kind of nailed it, but yeah, I'll elaborate a little bit. We are in meetings with industry, data collecting right now so that we can have discussions with First Nations for stewardship of the land, and something that they will lead, and then be able to come up with a balanced approach for our backcountry, our forestry, management of land. And pretty much all things that First Nations have been concerned about, and even those who are been doing some of the protesting. So this is coming up with a balanced approach that's going to meet the needs of the community and meet the needs of those concerned about our forest community. That pretty much nails it. Any comments or questions, Councillor Elliott and Councillor Charlotte?
So what does the $125,000 pay for?
Want to just elaborate on that, Ms. Brown?
Through your worship, economic impact analysis, working with a consultant to identify and measure the sectoral impacts, and looking at some modeling in different related sectors. So we have an actual very good understanding of what the impacts will be on our community. That will enable us to go to the Ministry of Jobs, Economic Recovery and Innovation, as well as Ministry of Forests, to request, say, funds to help with workforce transition, capital investment, sustainable forestry practices, retooling. So there's a number of pieces we have to do. Economic impact analysis is one. Additional research into sustainable forestry practices, some community-led mitigation strategies, support for workforce development and transition, and basically just positioning ourselves to be able to respond to issues as they come up over the next year or two, while we wait for the ministry to come forward with some long-term funded solutions for our community.
Well, words.
Yeah, is there anything concrete? I mean, I know the analysis is good, but you know the forest industry is changing. Caribou are out there. The national government is going to make some hard choices for us. A lot of things are happening. I don't know. I think the business world will react on their own. I don't know if they need to.
So I'm going to kind of weigh in a little bit. So when we look at what we've been working on for the community, it's basically come up with a plan that's going to be a balanced approach so that we can carry on having some sort of forestry in our community, but also dealing with all the issues. So when we talk about caribou, when we talk about the old growth deferrals, when we talk about all of that, then how do we maintain, and then how do we keep this going for sustainability, both in the backcountry for recreation, but also in making sure that the backcountry stays safe. And so when I talk to First Nations, we talk about air, water, the mountains, land, their medicines, and then we also talk about making sure that everything's sustainable for our grandchildren as we move forward and their grandchildren. So we're looking at a balanced approach to find that. It takes a bit of data to get that information and a plan to move things forward. And being able to come up with some of our concerns, but also so that the First Nations can deal with their concerns as well. It sounds like a lot of words. It's a lot of words.
But is there any guarantee that the province will adhere to what you recommend?
So what we're doing now is the province has said they will understand First Nations-led programs like this. And so we've come to them, we've talked to them, and basically said, this is where we're at. In the words of the minister to me, where Gary, you are already ahead of the plan that we want to see come forward. So it's a great way to start the process. It's just a start. And now it's basically having First Nations help lead us through the process. Councillor Chalette.
Thank you, Worship. I really like seeing the term community-led, but I'm curious about what that looks like. I find that since before I was on council, I think when I was early in my Chamber of Commerce days even, I remember hearing this talk about place-based solutions. Our challenge here is that we get lumped with various different regional areas and the policies are all regional based. So for example, with employment, we run into problems because the unemployment rate in our region does not qualify us to then access some of the supports otherwise available. So not being responsive to those local and specific place-based metrics and challenges. So when we look at community-led, one of the challenges is there's just so much information, there is so much data to share, there are so many different stakeholders, and here we're talking about forestry, but I appreciate the report, like there are other industries that we should be paying attention to as well. And how do we design a community-led process that brings us to the table together to make this effective? Because it's one thing to communicate with the leaders of the different stakeholder groups and to find shared values, to compromise and find a way forward. It's another to be able to communicate that back out to the residents and our members so that they understand that we have their back, that we are looking out for their best interest, and to check in that it's actually in their best interest. It's one thing for us to lose connection and think that we're doing the right thing. It's another to proof test, like to test that with actual people on the ground. Through the chair, I would like to hear a little bit more about what community-led strategies look like, and if there are any challenges foreseen with that.
So, Ms. Brown, I'm just going to go back over some history and then we'll talk a little bit about this. So when we go back to forestry being devastated in this community back in the early 80s,
Yeah.
if it wasn't for community-led, so people who are in the industry and my predecessor, your predecessors on council, coming up with Revelstoke Community Forest Corporation, the ability to buy our forest lands, and then the ability of our mills, 3 mills, to weigh in with some money, along with the city, to buy that forest corporation, to regenerate a mill, to start the process of logging back in the community. We wouldn't have any of that sort of thing. So that was one community-driven program. And so when I talked to my predecessors about how that was employed, them working through the nights, and I'm talking about CSRD people as well, sitting around the table, community people as well, all coming up with a plan, and then one gentleman taking that plan and driving it to Victoria through the night to arrive in the morning to present it to the minister and have it accepted. That's what we call a Revelstoke solution. We've been doing that again and again over the years. So this is kind of the process that we've started here. So we've gone out and reached out to our provincial colleagues and say, what is it that we can do? What can we say? And so anything when we talk about backcountry management, they want to see community-led, which means certain people in the community, yes, but those are community residents. And then when we talk about industry setting at the table, yes, industry. We talk about our group, our liaison group, so people in the community who are already involved in other focus groups. And then we talk about First Nations and we talk about all the bands and how they can work into. So we're just working through those sorts of things as to how it's going to look right now. We don't have a defined, clear picture as to how it's going to look. However, the ministers are basically saying, you run with it. You know what our mandates are. We've talked to First Nations. They basically say, we're not happy with some of the things that the province has come up with. We want to see a balanced approach as well. But we have to have them at the table leading it, because in their words, they're the title holders of the land. And so we want to see what they have for everything, for sustainability as we move forward. So I think it's a great thing. The money that we're doing here will help us to put some of the people in place to be able to sit at the table with everyone else to come up with a plan so that we can come up with something that we can go to the ministry with and say, this is it. And then having some of the people around the table who even oppose what we're doing here to give their input is imperative as well.
Yeah.
Right? Okay. Ms. Braun, I'll have you weigh in.
I just wanted to add a comment that in essence, I hear, some of the councillors' questions about what does it look like. The truth is we are looking at some proposals for how we move forward with this. I would like to make sure that we access EOF funds. I think it's an appropriate source of funding for this, given that most of the industry sector activity is on Crown or community, owned land in the CSRD Area B. We will be considering proposals for how to make sure we have a data-driven fundamental approach, and I want to ensure we're not using taxpayers' funds to support that. So in essence, this gets us the funds in place first so that we can go ahead and purchase the data and purchase the consulting expertise we need that will help us provide a very, very strong case for the province, for the ministries, and for our First Nations partners, led by them, as to how we can move forward. So you will be seeing, I assume it would be in camera if it's a contract work, you will be seeing something coming forward soon. I want to ensure that we have the funds in place to negotiate in good faith with, to purchase data and negotiate with contractors.
All right.
Does that help?
Yeah, Councilor Palmer.
Thank you, Mayor Sulz. To me, this is a good use of, if I'm understanding it correctly, is a good use of EOF funds. Just for clarity on the motion that's on the table, so the 125,000, the intention of the motion is from EOF funds?
Correct.
And then just for clarity on the motion, it's to facilitate forestry industry transition planning? Is
that a good way to put it, Ms. Braun?
Yes, I've actually expanded it somewhat to facilitate industry sector development planning, because there are other related sectors. So as we are looking at the forestry sector specifically, there's other related sectors we also want to position ourselves for responding to, ensuring we take advantage of emerging economic opportunities as we transition. And again, this is the first phase. This is really just the start, initial phase of a response to these potential impacts across many sectors, but forestry is the key one, certainly, and is the one that is crucial to get out in front of and be sure we have some tools at our disposal right out of the gate.
Okay, so go ahead. So on the list, the spreadsheet, that 125,000 EOF funds for 2022 is forestry transition engagement and planning. That I understand, and that's what I've been understanding throughout. When we start talking other sectors of forestry, then I start to get the clarity is disappearing from me. Attention is here. So on that 125,000, so are we anticipating most of that money is going to some contracted services somewhere?
I think it's too soon for me to say most until we have some proposals in front of us. We already have purchased some data to support our just gathering information and making sure that we have an informed basis to work from. I don't know yet what the proposals will look like or what the costs will come in at, and we'll bring that to council when we do.
So Mayor Sulz, I propose just a slight adjustment to this. I could do it as an amending motion, but it's just for clarity, that this is EOF funds. So the motion on the table is recommendation be made to the Columbia-Shuswap Regional District Board, CSRD, to allocate $125,000, I would suggest including the of EOF funds to the Community Economic Development Department for the City of Revelstoke and CSRD Area B to facilitate forestry industry sector transition planning, just for, unless that's a problem, but I was looking for that clarity.
Do you want to narrow down that, or what you've already discussed with the Area B director? He's comfortable in these words. We just need to have the funds coming from the EOF. Is that correct?
That's correct. All of these recommendations, all 5, are all related to the EOF funding. And this is going in its current iteration to the CSRD board on Thursday. In fact, they already have it probably.
Yeah. Okay, so can we just change that to come from EOF, even though it's not written in here, basically? Yeah, none of the other ones have that, or all of the other ones. It's basically economic opportunity funding for several projects. So are you okay with the wording, leaving it?
I'm okay leaving it. When in hindsight, I look at some of the wording for that clarity, because it's saying, well, where are these funds coming from? I'm okay because the intent is understood.
Sure.
Slightly prefer the adjustment. There seems to be quite a bit of fuzziness around this thing. We're well in the year when we start other sectors other than forestry industry, and I think the target of the forest industry, because we're in a crisis right now, essentially between the changes. So I think I'm really hoping this is about the forestry sector and about.
Yeah, and the reason it says facilitate industry sector development is there may be 1 or 2 other industries that that we haven't seen come to the table that are affected by the forestry. And that's the sort of thing. Am I understanding that correct, Ms. Brown?
Yes, that is correct. I think depending on what we see with some of the proposals that the consultant will bring us, is there some ways to help the forestry sector transition into related, for instance, mass timber production. There's all kinds of other ways to retool and respond to the impacts on our community, which frankly, we don't have a full grasp of yet. So we're just trying to get out in front of this potential transition and be ready to address it with all the tools and some forethought and some planning, some prior planning with industry partners, with First Nations before we bear the brunt of the impacts.
All right, so are you comfortable with that? Now is it a little clearer for you, Councillor?
Yes.
All right, Councillor Elliott and Councillor Schiller.
Okay, just for my peace of mind, has the forestry industry or the proponents involved in that field, have they outreached to us at this point? Has there been an outcry of need of help?
Oh, absolutely.
Is that right? Okay, but that's okay. And then the other element to this is if it's going to be led by First Nations, the 4 or 5 local areas that have a history in this area, how do we reach an agreement between all of them? Which group of those nations will be negotiating?
So they're basically, so we're going to sit down with probably all of the members of the Schwetler group, and
That's just one group, one of them.
Just one group. Then we've got the Alliance, who I've spoken to already, and then we'll talk about some of the others. The invitation will be open to all of them. How they want to participate will be up to them. Some of them will be willing to come to the table and talk, and some of them may say, I'm not at that point yet, and that's totally up to their nation. And so we need to start somewhere. The invitation to all is to how things are prepared by the provincial government now. What's your concerns? What do we need to address? And you tell us how we should be working as we move forward.
Yes, it's just it can, to me, it seems like it's a recipe for chasing your tail, because there's so many different elements to it.
Well, it can be a recipe for chasing our tail. Our intention, though, is to come up with something like we did in the 80s, to come up with a solution. And so the First Nations are saying, they want to sit down with us, they want to come up with a solution for a Revelstoke or area made in solution for the government. They've already had meetings with the government and have brought this up to the government. And so some of the Zoom meetings that I've been on with both the ministry and First Nations, they're all in agreement that we can sit down at a table and come up with something that works for everyone around the table and be able to iron out our differences face to face.
Yeah, and I just like, is this a, do you think a consensus can be reached?
Absolutely.
Well, that's what I want to get to, because I don't know if it can with.
Well, when you have people at the table that want to come up with a consensus, then absolutely. And so that's what we're hearing.
Okay.
And that's why we want to move. All right, any other comments on the motion on the table? Seeing none, I'll call the question. All those in favor? Opposed? Motion's carried. Thank you. All right, item C, Resort Municipality Initiative. So Councillor Schiller.
That the Resort Municipality Initiative Funding Notification and the Revelstoke Resort Development Strategy Guide for Communities document be received for information.
Seconder for that motion, please. Councillor Brooks Hill. Any discussion on that motion? Councillor Palmer.
Just a note that on receiving motions, the material is already in the package. The motions are a redundant statement.
Great, thank you for that. Okay, Councillor Schiller.
Just to clarify in the motion, it talks about the Revelstoke Resort Development Strategy Guide. But is that referring to the guide that I see linked as just a general resort development strategy guide from the province? Is that the guide that we're talking about?
Ms.
Yes.
Brown? Thank you.
Yes.
Okay.
Okay. Any other discussion on the motion? All those in favor? Motion's carried. Moving on, item 2. Councillor Schiller.
That the revised terms of reference dated April 6, 2022 for the Tourism Initiatives Committee be approved.
Seconder for the motion, please. Councillor Ryan. Discussion on that motion. Councillor Palmer, do you want to weigh in?
Yeah, just note one of the notable changes to this is the more diversification of the voting members of the board, and I think it's a significant improvement. It previously was pretty much the accommodation sector, but now it includes the chamber, the arts and culture sector, outdoor recreation operators, Indigenous communities, and I think that's a welcome broadening of the scope of interest.
Thanks for that input. That's a committee that you sit on. I appreciate that. Any other comments? Seeing none, all those in favor? Motion's carried. Moving on to item 3. Councillor Gillette.
That the proposed process for renewing the resort development strategy for 2022 to 2024 be approved.
Seconder for the motion, please. Councillor Elliott. Discussion on the motion. Councillor Gillette.
I will restate my comment from earlier that I am very grateful to see this program change and listen to the feedback from its members. So some of them we've already talked about briefly. The restorative maintenance on tourism infrastructure is a huge deal. Although from your comment, Ms. Brown, it sounds like that is for infrastructure that was originally funded from RMI funds, not other infrastructure.
Exactly.
Okay. The fact that planning activities and administration is more of an allowable expense, because I think that's been a weakness of the program in the past, that it's great to get all this money to do things, but we don't have money to talk about it or plan it out properly, to be mindful of how we do this and intentional so that we do hit these goals that Councillor Elliott's speaking to. And then easing those reporting requirements. I am interested to see how this development strategy and the switch to a destination management strategy versus marketing, how that is going to play in with our other big strategies in the community, as well as the strategies from the province and the feds, mostly the province, I suppose. But for example, the province just put out their new economic strategy and how they want the Stronger BC document that has some really interesting concepts in it that if we can align with those those sustainability goals really effectively, I think that's going to open the door to more funds in the future. And I look forward to seeing how it comes together.
Awesome. Great. Any other comments? All those in favor? Opposed? No, motion's carried. Moving on to item D, development permit. We are starting to see things come through for employee housing at RMR. So, someone want to put this motion on the table, Councilor Palmer?
Yeah, I have just a question, and I'll put the motion on the table. So it seems that the second motion, this is to the planner, that the second motion is a conditional one. Would it be appropriate to make the motion conditional of, so that's all one motion, the second part?
Mr. Palmer, you wanted them separate for a reason, or this is dealing with the security for landscaping?
Just see Paul again.
Sorry, through your worship.
If you can take off the, stop sharing the screen so we can see staff, if you don't mind, Ms. Russo. Thank you.
Through your worship, just so I'm understanding the question correctly, is it asking why the motions are separated into two?
Correct.
Essentially, yes. I'm suggesting that I put the motion on the table, like as one as written, conditional that the applicant, in that second.
So through your worship, Councillor Palmer, resolution number 2 with respect to the landscape security. Staff have been working with applicants, you'll notice, to make that a requirement of building permit issuance rather than development permit issuance. So this helps expedite the process while still making sure we're achieving the same objective. So that allows council to actually issue the permit today. So we would prefer to keep it as 2 separate resolutions.
So I'll put the motion on the table. The development permit DP 2020-26 be issued for form and character and development within an environmentally hazardous and environmentally sensitive area to construct 3 employee housing buildings with related amenities and a garbage enclosure at 3128 Camosi Road, legal subdivision 4, section 13, township 23, range 2, west of the 6th Meridian Kootenai district, except 1, plans 5682, 10031, 12547, 15044, NEP 85319, and NEP 87491, PID 012-182-8281.
Seconding it, Councilor Shalit, seconding it.
Also,
Yes, go ahead.
Yeah, sorry for that laborious thing. I'm probably more sensitive to these sort of legal ones. That's the ones that have. And also, I think this is really good. This is going to be alleviate. I hope the applicant gets on construction right away.
Yes.
Because this is dealing with not only their housing crisis, but for the city as a whole. So I think it's a good thing overall.
Great, thanks for that. Any other comments, Councilor Brooksmith?
I have a question which is perhaps unrelated to this motion. Just the third part of this item, the council authorized the discharge of bylaw contravention notice LB 513346. I couldn't find anything in the package about that.
Yeah, there is a section.
Really?
Yeah,
But
yeah.
Here, I'll find it so you can review by the time you get there.
someone give me the gist
Do
of
you
it.
want to weigh in, Mr. Simon, so we get the Reader's Digest version real quick?
That part's not going to influence me on the first part.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right, so we'll deal with that when we get to it. All right. Any discussion on the development permit? Seeing none, all those in favor? Motion's carried. Someone want to put number 2 on the table for me, please? Councilor Shalit?
The applicant provide a security for the due and proper completion of landscaping in the amount of $125,000 or the amount identified in the cost estimate to the city of Revelstoke in the form of cash or unconditional, irrevocable auto-renewing letter of credit issued by a Canadian Charter Bank or credit union prior to issuance of a building permit. This landscape security satisfies landscaping requirements associated with DP 2022-006.
Just a clarification, it's 125% of the amount identified, not 125 grand.
Oh, sorry, yes, 125%. Sorry.
All right, so is there a second for that motion, please? Councilor Elliott, discussion on that motion. Seeing none, all those in favor? Motion's carried. Item number 3, Councilor Brooks, you want to put this one on the table?
As previously stated, the council authorized the discharge of bylaw contravention notice LB 511346.
All right. So second, you got an extra one in there. Seconded by Councilor Charlotte. Discussion on this. So now, Mr. Simon, just some clarification, please.
Through your worship, I see that the corporate administration group has put it up on the screen for you. This was a notice that was registered on title due to a building being constructed without a building permit. The applicant has received a issued demolition permit for the building, so therefore we are okay to go ahead with discharging this to allow for the construction of the new permanent employee housing building on site.
All right, thank you for that. Appreciate that. Any further discussion on that motion? Councilor Ryan?
If we don't authorize the discharge, then do they have to demolish it?
So through your worship, they're already in process of demolishing those existing structures that were built without a building permit. It's just a matter of cleaning up the site and cleaning up the title to ensure that there's no issues with us ultimately being authorized to issue their building permit. So when there's a section 57 on a property, it makes it staff aren't allowed to issue another building permit to authorize construction essentially.
Oh, yeah, gotcha. Yeah, sweet.
Councilor Short.
I'm curious if we track or have an idea of how many bylaw contravention notices like this we have on file currently in the city.
Any idea, Mr. Simon?
Through your worship, just I missed the last part there, throughout the city.
Yes.
Yeah, in our community, how many like this are there out there?
Can we count that?
Through your worship, Councillor Charlotte, I wouldn't be able to put a number on it. I do know it was a frequent occurrence, I believe, in the late 90s, early 2000s. The city had a very regimented process of if you did not close your permit, then it would automatically go to council for section 57. And over the last few years, you guys probably noticed more of them coming to your attention. A lot of people, when they're selling properties, it's a condition of financing to get those titles or those notices off title. So it is becoming more and more common. The banks are picking up on it, hence why you're seeing more come to council.
Great, thank you.
All right, all those in favor? Motion's carried, thank you. All right, let's move on to item E. This is construction of employee housing, gravel parking area. So someone want to put that motion on the table? Councilor Palmer.
I'll put the motion as written.
All right. And second for the motion, please, Councilor Charlotte. Any discussion on the motion? Councilor Brooks Hill.
I believe it was this one buried in the report was the environmental assessment for the streams and for the riparian areas, Turtle Creek, and so they settled on it. Because there's no evidence of them being fish bearing, they had no obligation for a riparian area. And I find it unfortunate because they're turtle bearing streams.
Right.
But that doesn't seem to be a requirement. I know this isn't a city thing, but I just.
Environmental thing, yeah.
That's, I find that disappointing. I appreciate that they're gonna leave a 10-meter buffer from what I can understand, which to me is, I'd like to see more, but I believe we don't have a choice in this particularly.
Any comment, Mr. Simon?
Through your worship to Councillor Brooks Hill. So you'll actually notice with this permit, so whenever there's new development, you are correct. Historically, when there's development in proximity to Turtle Creek, the applicant received approvals from the province to reduce the streamside protection enhancement area from 30 meters down to 10 meters. Now, whenever there's new development, the proponent is required to go through that provincial review process again. So the permit that's being issued today, when you look at Schedule C within the issued permit, it very clearly delineates that we are not authorizing any works within that 30 meter riparian area. So the applicant, before they do any works in there, is actually going to need either an amendment to this permit or a subsequent permit showing that they've gone through the provincial review process again to delineate that distance from the stream to where they are authorized to do works.
Follow up, Councilor?
But the final decision is with the province on that riparian zone. Yeah, that's fine. I appreciate that. Thank you.
Councillor Shaw.
Thank you, Worship. This comes up, I think, frequently, because I think Councillor Bookstall and I think maybe similarly on this, and I think other councillors have brought this up as well, is we feel a little frustrated sometimes when the monitoring happens from the province, and it's their job to follow up and make sure these things get done. But we don't hear, or maybe don't have the capacity to hunt out those reports from the provincial websites to, I'm sure they're published somewhere in the public eye. But to find that, to loop back, to feel confident that this monitoring is happening, I'm curious if Your Worship, possibly in your conversations with the different various ministries and the work that's going on, do we have any engagement or conversation from the environmental ministry about some of these concerns? So especially like a large proponent like R&R?
We haven't had to date
Okay.
regarding that sort of thing. That doesn't mean that we can't have that.
Right.
sort of thing.
I'd be curious about looking at what would it take, what would a conversation look like at UBCM this fall to maybe check in with the environment, like the Ministry of Environment, to find out what kind of monitoring has been happening. Are there any consistent red flags or challenges, or have the crew over at R&R been following all of the procedures, and we can rest assured and assure our citizens that that's being done? Or what kind of, just looking at what kind of conversation we can have with them to dig into this a little bit more.
So why don't we see if we can get a meeting with the Environment Ministry office while we're down at UBC?
I'd like to look at it. One of the challenges I've seen in the past is when we set up appointments, I think first it would be nice to have a conversation of what kind of a conversation are we hoping for, and whether it's better suited with the minister or the staff. Because I feel like we get shuffled. Oh, well, you should have talked to staff. Oh, you should have talked to the minister. That's policy, not operations.
And so we can ask those questions up front
Great.
with them before we set the appointments. It's the same thing when we talked to Ministry of Transportation a few years ago, and he said, who do you want to meet with? I said, I want to meet with the people that get the work done. And by meeting with the staff, we actually accomplish stuff,
Exactly.
right? So I think that's a good.
Might be worth talking at some of it.
So just for clarity, are we stepping beyond our jurisdiction? First of all, anything to do with riparian is dealt with at the provincial level.
And so the question
So they
is,
set the rules, they did the verification.
Yeah.
We just want to make sure that it's been done.
Exactly.
So I think that's a requirement that the development department, when they get a report, say, okay, have you got your riparian approval from the province? You ask for it, if it's done, it's done. We don't want to investigate, we don't want to throw guys, we don't want to hire someone who knows riparian regulations. We don't need to get that deep into it. It's already being done.
Yeah.
Because we just want to ensure that that step hasn't been missed. And that's on our checklist from the development department.
exactly. And so our job as politicians isn't to get involved in that. Our job is to ask the questions, how is this done? So that's clear in our mind. It's never to interfere.
Yeah, because the work is being done. I mean,
Yeah.
they're on it. If you start infringing on it, they come down, the riparian guys come down, the environmental guys are out there looking all the time. So just so they're doing their job. It's just whether that news is getting to us.
Yeah, and then it's our job as counsel for our community to be able to say, this is the procedure, this is how they do it. It's not for us to intrude. Councilor Palmer.
Thank you. Through to the planner. Could council, if council decided with option one, cite additional concerns around those environmental, so it's 10 meters right now, could council hypothetically require something more than that?
Through your worship to Councillor Palmer, I would note you to Schedule C within the draft development permit, as well as some of the permanent conditions that are in there. You'll see on page 2 of 2 within Schedule C, staff have already outlined that 30-meter riparian assessment area and confirmed in the permit that no works are authorized in there. So I would point to council that it looks like that additional protections that council seems to be looking for are already embedded as part of the permit application.
So just I need to make sure I understand. So we've had a somewhat of a hypothetical discussion around the council table, but we are required through this resolution, we're requiring something more than the province would require?
Through your worship, it's not something more than what the province would require. It's something that ensures alignment with the riparian area protection regulation. One thing to be aware of is when we're talking development permits, any requirements imposed as part of a development permit need to be directly related to the development permit area guidelines. We can't, neither staff nor council can go outside the scope of those guidelines. So we need to make sure that any approvals we're issuing are within the scope of those guidelines.
So, and I'm just making sure I understand. So thanks for bearing with me. So we couldn't say, arbitrarily say we want 40 meters.
Through your worship, I'd have to do a more thorough review because the development permit area guidelines for the RMR area are quite extensive. But off the top of my head, in reviewing them, they basically require adherence to the provincial regulations such as Water Sustainability Act, riparian area protection regulation. So I would caution council, I guess, about going above and beyond what those requirements are as imposed by the provincial government.
So it's an interesting thing. I'm sort of digressing a little bit here. I just was grappling with that. So like if there was a really special grove of trees that we wanted protected in that, hypothetically, that question is, where do we have ability and where do we not? And I'm suggesting it's not quite as black and white as the debate that was around the table. But I'm satisfied with the conditions that are being met, are being required at this point.
Any other comments on the motion on the table? Seeing none, all those in favor? Motion's carried. Thank you. Item F, Housing Action Plan. So Mr. Simon, you have some guests with you today.
Through your worship to council, yes, we have Mr. Thompson, Matt Thompson, who is community housing lead with Urban Matters and has been very helpful and supportive in getting our housing action plan underway. And we're excited to share with you the presentation about where we're at today, some of the options that we have as a local government to try and support housing within the community. This is obviously something that's top of everyone's mind. As the OCP is working its way through the process, you're going to see a lot of policies in there regarding housing. Ms. Braun was on here, Director Braun was on here earlier discussing housing, something that's very important. So we're happy to have Mr. Thompson here with us today. And I believe he has the ability to share his screen. You guys should have a copy of the PowerPoint presentation in the agenda package as well. And we will be sure to post it to TalkRevelstoke as well so that the community can see it too.
Thank you.
With that, I will pass it over to Matt.
Thank you, Paul. A couple of things. First of all, I was having some issues with my microphone earlier. Can you hear me loud and clear right now?
We can.
Okay, great. And you can see my screen share, which shows the opening slide of this presentation.
You can.
Perfect. Thank you very much. Thank you, Mayor and Council, for your time today. Last time I was in front of you was in December of last year, and so we've made some considerable progress since the last time I spoke. And so I'm here to provide an update and answer any questions you may have about the process to date. Here we are. So just a brief agenda, a little reminder on the project background. I've prepared some slides on typical and emerging roles of local government in addressing and supporting housing. Then I have a few slides on what we've heard through our engagement through late winter and spring, and then moving into some of our draft actions that we've prepared so you can understand the directions we're heading and provide comments or questions on it. So by way of background, the housing plan action plan has identified several objectives. The primary objective is that key actions in the plan will support diverse, balanced, affordable, and healthy housing for the residents of Revelstoke. The housing action plan as a project has been based on several guiding principles, including alignment with the ongoing OCP updates, as well as other planning efforts. It's premised on the idea that all the actions will reflect the local context and needs in Revelstoke, and therefore is built on work that came before this project, the housing needs report, projections, as well as all the ongoing engagement efforts that staff and other consultants are undertaking, particularly with regards to the OCP, but also with regards to other projects that the city is currently or looking to undertake. We have prioritized a 5-year time frame, primarily because so much of the funding landscape has changed in the last 5 years. And looking ahead, it's important to understand that it could change again and identify what staff, council, and stakeholders have achieved in that time frame. And then, of course, the process and the housing action plan itself will ensure an inclusive approach to housing in Revelstoke, that the needs of all residents are considered through the actions. So the timeline, it looks like
Can
right
you
now.
just a bit, Nicole?
We're just having a hard
I'm
time.
having a hard time hearing you, Matt. You're
Are you
big.
okay? Sorry, I think it's my microphone, so I'm just going to lean in a bit and try to speak.
Yeah,
That's better.
Matt, if you
Okay.
also slow down a little bit, when you go too fast, it skips a bit, it seems.
So this is just a reminder of the project schedule. We started our work in December of last year with engagement, beginning the process of engagement. We through January and February, we heard from a number of stakeholders through a couple of focus groups that we did. And then we also undertook a survey, which I'll talk a little bit more about in a few minutes. Through March and early April, we've been preparing for what we heard report, which is almost finalized, and the draft actions, which we'll be hearing about later in today's presentation. And then, of course, we're into a council update now and looking ahead, kind of finalizing through late April and May and into June, finalizing the plan, probably going back out for one more round of community engagement with the draft actions to check in with stakeholders that were part of earlier engagements, and then bringing the finalized plan back in front of council in June or perhaps early July for council consideration. So part of setting the context for the conversation around an action plan is understanding what is the role of local government in terms of supporting housing. And of course, the housing continuum represents quite a wide variety of housing, all the way from emergency shelters all the way up to market housing. Now, local governments have traditionally played a role in supporting and delivering market housing through things like official community plans, through zoning bylaws, considerations of density. All of these would be considered ways that local government facilitate development. But of course, there are also emerging roles that local governments are looking at now. Thinking about developing affordable housing reserves, identifying lands that can be used to invest in and support the development of priority housing types, new forms of regulation that protect or tenants and renters or rent themselves, as well as education and advocacy, both upwards to senior levels of government, but also outwards in the community, about the importance of a variety of housing types in any given community. We also, of course, see that senior government is very much wanting to see partnerships that local governments are involved in any form of housing project where they're making an investment. But we also know that the need to develop housing goes beyond what local government can do alone. In BC, of course, we have a crown corporation in the form of BC Housing that is a primary and significant funder. We also have CMHC emerging back onto the scene as a new funder after several decades of kind of dormancy through both financing and to some extent capital investment. So we've got these two sort of senior government agencies who are funders and sometimes developers. In BC, the primary developers of non-market housing are the nonprofit sector. There are of course some exceptions to that, but they're generally sort of outliers rather than exceptions to the rule. So Whistler Housing Authority and Vancouver Affordable Housing Authority are two examples of arm's length municipal entities, but they also are outliers for a reason, which I won't get into now. And so kind of are beyond the scope of what a typical local government might take on. And so it's important to understand the roles of different players within the housing sector, as well as the most effective ways that local government can kind of support and participate in the development of priority housing. And so I'm just going to walk you through a few examples. These are not necessarily intended to be recommendations at this point, simply examples of how different local governments have played one or more of these roles in supporting the kinds of housing that they have prioritized or want to see in their community. So, for example, there is increased discussion around putting greater density on single-family lots. This can look like a variety of different things. It can look like just allowing secondary suites on all single-family lots, or it can look more like greater flexibility around density, such as those the city of Kelowna put in around through their RU7 zoning on single-family lots around the downtown core, or the city of Coquitlam, which has developed what they call a housing choices program, which essentially for most single-family lots in the selected areas removes rezoning as a requirement to put a secondary suite or a carriage home, so up to 3 units. And it's only when you get to, I believe, 4 or above that you start looking at needing to go through more complex development approvals processes. So both examples that are simply intended to reduce barriers, particularly on single-family lots, to support a greater, gentle density in full housing. Other examples of facilitating development include looking at policies that support the development of units or the contribution of cash in lieu in new developments that are getting density bonuses. A couple of examples, they're quite different examples. The city of North Vancouver uses density bonusing when they have quite a large stock of existing purpose-built rental. A lot of it's quite old, and so they anticipate significant redevelopment. And so they provide a density bonusing program for the redevelopment of those units that requires a certain portion of the units being provided at a below market rate. City of Richmond has its own inclusionary zoning policy, which essentially requires that a certain proportion of units in developments of 60 units or more be contributed over to a low end of the market rental program. So again, two examples of facilitating development through density bonusing or inclusionary zoning policy. Obviously, the regulatory role is a key role for local governments. Land use and density is one element of the regulatory framework that local governments get into to support housing. In terms of land use and density, just looking at expanded ability to build coach or carriage or laneway homes. There is now provision in the provincial building code to provide lock-off suites and condominiums and townhouses, which both provides market rental opportunities, but also can act as a mortgage helper for first-time buyers. And then also pre-zoning for moderate or infill density are all examples of sort of taking that kind of high-level thinking and translating into a regulatory framework like a zoning bylaw. Another important role, of course, that the local governments can play is in the protection of tenants or rental units. The city of Maple Ridge, for example, has a manufactured home relocation and tenant relocation policy. There are examples of strata conversion policies where vacancy rates in the community have to be above a certain threshold before old purpose-built rental can be turned into stratas. There are a lot of urban municipalities are looking at more aggressive rental replacement policies where there needs to be a 1-to-1 replacement of all rental when it's been developed. And of course, there are examples of short-term vacation rental. They all look quite different, especially amongst high tourism communities like Revelstoke. The district of Tofino is one early adopter. There are other examples out there that are currently being worked through, and I understand that policy is already well underway in Revelstoke. Just an example of the different kinds of regulatory protections that local governments can put in place. Investing and incentivizing are increasingly, these are new roles that local governments, I would say, have from 10 years ago to now have taken considerable leadership on, particularly even in sort of medium-sized communities across BC. Investing can look like the development of an affordable housing reserve, that is then used to contribute to offset costs in new non-market projects. Larger municipalities are looking at a land acquisition strategy, of course, recognizing that that in and of itself can cost money and resources, and certainly isn't feasible in all communities, but it is something that larger urban areas are looking at. And then wanting to note, of course, that the online accommodation platform funding that Revelstoke currently has can directly support the development of an affordable housing reserve. And I'll speak again about that in a few minutes when I get to some of the draft recommendations. In addition to investing in affordable housing or non-market projects, the municipality can also incentivize specific kinds of projects through a number of different avenues. The three primary ones that we tend to see in BC, even in smaller communities, is waiving or reducing development fees for target housing. In particular, you hear a lot about the waiving or the reduction of development cost charges. In reality, what a lot of local governments will do is draw on their affordable housing reserve to essentially subsidize the DCC. So that the municipality does not have to eat that cost, but it does then also take the cost burden off the non-market housing provider and increase affordability. Other examples of incentive programs include reduced parking requirements, particularly for housing that may require less parking, housing for seniors, housing for supportive housing, or housing for individuals at a kind of deep subsidy level, where there may be less dependency on cars. And then finally, expedited approvals process, what is sometimes called a fast track process for non-market or priority housing types, can be an effective incentive tool. Finally, the last couple slides here on roles, and then I'll move into the draft actions and strategies. Of course, there is a role for advocacy and education when it comes to local government. The City of Kamloops has a fairly well-known developers information package that identifies both city municipal programs that come into play when there's a component of affordable housing, but they also identify senior government programs, everything from seed funding to for CMHC to the rental construction financing initiative, which is the really popular program amongst developers intended to boost the supply of market rental housing. There are also examples in Canmore and City of Kamloops around kind of early and ongoing engagement with communities and neighborhoods even prior to projects going in to educate residents on the importance of diverse housing and the city's overall approach or the municipality's overall approach, so that residents don't feel like when a project is proposed that it comes out of the blue, but rather than communicated early and effectively. Finally, partnerships, and these sort of link back in some ways to some of the things that I've already talked about. There are, land contributions and leases are often identified as one of the most effective things that local governments can do, particularly from a senior government perspective, because bringing land to the table really reduces a significant development cost. And so both BC Housing, CMHC, in order to get a seed funding grant, you do need to have some form of land identified, and at least at minimum a letter of partnership and intent of partnership from the landholder, and often this can be a municipality if there is suitable land available. Other examples of kind of ongoing work include regional planning initiatives through the Capital Provincial District, through the SCRD, through Cowichan Valley Regional District, outsourcing social planning opportunities. The City of Vernon, for a long time, had a social planning council that they provided and will kind of grant to in order to support social planning efforts in the community. And then finally, BC Housing has this program called Housing Hub, which is intended to work with developers around more market-oriented rental as well as affordable homeownership programs. So those are all examples of forms of partnerships that local governments are or can be involved in that support and facilitate the development of housing. So I'm going to move into some of our slides on what we heard. So as I mentioned earlier, just a couple months ago, we undertook focus groups in Revelstoke, as well as a workforce housing survey. So the focus groups drew from 22 participants across the community, including nonprofit service providers, private developers, employers and businesses, builders and contractors, members of the ACP and the Social Development Committee, members of the Economic Development Commission, Revelstoke Community Housing Society, and Community Futures. So as diverse as we could get within those two meeting times, but a really great cross-section and very lively conversation from participants there. We also undertook a workforce housing survey through late February to mid-March, and we received 35 responses from across 15 different industries in the community, all of whom identified strong need to work together on the housing issue. So what did we hear from focus group participants? Obviously, there are a number of housing issues facing Revelstoke, which is obvious news to council, I'm sure. There are supply and development restrictions. There are challenges around capacity in the nonprofit sector. There currently isn't the diversity and suitability of housing options that stakeholders might like to see to meet the needs of all residents. More broadly speaking, incomes are not keeping pace with the cost of housing. And this is really a trend we're seeing right across most of the province, certainly the southern half of the province. And then, of course, there are other socioeconomic factors impacting the housing system, inflation, the drug crisis, and the opioid epidemic, a number of different things that all sort of come together and create greater hardships for different folks in the housing system that can't currently kind of keep pace with rents, the cost of housing that are increasing. There were also a number of different underserved demographics that we saw: seniors, lone parents who are typically single incomes and don't have as much housing choice, individuals with diverse abilities, especially those living in group homes or still with their parents, even the staff of nonprofits, maybe kind of at the border of a living wage, seasonal and workforce staff, and single-person households, as well as students and first-time homeowners. So quite a diverse cross-section of folks that were identified as experiencing pressure within the housing system in Revelstoke. Participants also identified a number of areas where potential action could be taken. For example, addressing supply and development restrictions, building nonprofit capacity, increasing the diversity and suitability of housing options, addressing immediate needs for people in unstable housing, and really prioritizing housing internally in the culture of the city, both at staff level and at the level. So moving to the workforce housing survey that was conducted with local businesses and employers. And this is just a couple of quick slides because we had quite a number of questions. But 88% of the participants or respondents to the survey identified a need for more workers in the past year, and 81% of respondents had employees leave due to housing issues. So 4 out of 5 employers in the community that were surveyed had issues with employee retention because of housing. There were a number of different housing issues that were identified. We kind of see 3 that are sort of hitting the 90%: a lack of housing supply, an inability to purchase a home, and just general unaffordability were the 3 top issues identified, followed by insecure housing or a lack of stability, or housing in poor condition and in need of repair. In addition, we asked participants or respondents to rate their priority housing types that they felt would support the needs of their employees. And so what we see here is essentially the high priority items are in blue. So starting with dark blue to really high priority, light blue is kind of a moderate priority. And then once we get into the gray, we're neutral and then low priority. And so what we can see here is that long-term market rentals and below market long-term rentals were the two highest kind of priority units identified by employers, then followed by below market ownership and market ownership. With short-term rentals, both at market and below market levels, being less of a priority from an employer perspective. And so finally, what does this all mean, and where are we going with this information? I want to walk you briefly through our draft actions. I will caution, of course, these remain high level at this point because we wanted to receive input from council. We will be doing another round of engagement with the community. And what we've really been focusing on is identifying at a high level items that are going to address both the needs that have been identified in the sort of quantitative evidence base, that is the phase 1 report that we've completed, as well as the housing needs report, and also actions that will address the issues that were raised through stakeholder engagement. We also, I think, have done our best to tailor a set of recommendations that are actually feasible. It's no use to a community to bring you a laundry list of items that are not implementable because there aren't resources in place. We recognize that Revelstoke is not an urban municipality. It is a small and thriving resort municipality, but there is not unlimited staff capacity to support new projects or to focus in only on housing. So we've done our best to create some actions that will increase the resources available that Revelstoke has to respond to the housing crisis, as well as identify, I think, some feasible kind of sub-actions that staff can actually implement and work in partnership. So of course, there's necessary refinement to be done as we continue to move through drafting the plan. But we'll start first with kind of 3 big groups that we've identified. The first is to develop a suitable density bonusing or inclusionary zoning program across a range of neighborhoods that yields a suitable contribution of either cash or units that can go towards an affordable housing reserve or directly to nonprofit management. To support this work, we are currently undertaking a land economics analysis. We've conducted some of the preliminary analysis on that, which I can speak to at a high level for the Johnson lands and the downtown core, if there's interest from council. But both of those do indicate or support, at least in the early analysis, that there's room for a policy like this that will help contribute either through units in a kind of comprehensive planning sense, or more likely in the downtown core through kind of cash contributions to an affordable housing reserve that can then be built up and dedicated towards priority projects or incentives as council prioritizes moving forward for priority housing types. So that is the mechanism by which the municipality can capture value from developers. And I will note that a big part of the analysis that we undertake is intended to not unduly burden the development sector. We believe, or we work with them to identify opportunities for them to pay their fair share, but not that they take on all the risk and then receive none of the reward. So we're trying to strike a balanced and transparent approach here. So then those programs then can be used to support the development of an affordable housing reserve fund. And that can work in partnership with the online accommodation platform funds to support a range of housing opportunities. These include, but aren't necessarily limited to, land or unit acquisition, contributions to improve existing conditions in priority housing projects, offsetting development application costs with building permits and decency charges, or grant programs to support priority housing initiatives. So number 1 and 2 are very tightly linked together in that the the sort of developer contribution program comes first, and then that supports the Affordable Housing Reserve in partnership with the online accommodation platform, which has funds already being delivered to the municipality. And then finally, more of a kind of review exercise, but is identifying city lands that may be feasible for the purposes of affordable housing. Again, that being one of the strong messages we consistently hear from senior government is land contributions are a big and important part of the puzzle when it comes to getting senior government funding at the table. Then we move into our priority strategies. So the big moves are kind of the big ticket items at the front, and are intended to support policy and development that will allow council to support the priority projects coming forward. But then there are a number of ways that the city is already engaged in towards supporting the kind of diversity of other issues that have been raised through the engagement process. So the first is continuing to support the city's vulnerable populations. The city is already undertaking a partnership with Community Connections around emergency housing. And so using the findings from and the data that's collected through that process to better advocate to the province for more housing supports, particularly on the supportive or deeply subsidized end of the housing continuum is key. And so having that program underway is a great win and an ability to kind of learn from it and use it to collect information that forms the basis of advocacy is key. There are a number of ways that the municipality can incentivize deeply affordable housing types. I've touched on some of them today, and the action plan we'll talk about those in more detail. Also, prioritizing the city resources to support affordable housing for vulnerable populations. So thinking back to those big moves that we saw a slide ago, how can they go towards supporting vulnerable populations in the city? And then finally, supporting and partnering with social service delivery to ensure that basic needs are met. Priority strategy number 2 is increasing the supply of workforce housing in the community. This includes developing a targeted incentive investment program, again, looking at the Affordable Housing Reserve and whether there are any land opportunities to support below market and low end market rental housing initiatives. So again, linking back to the previous priority strategy because there's overlap. So it's almost like developing a bit of a sliding scale incentive program where greater incentives are targeted for the deeper affordability that we provide. Identifying and working with other partners, including developers, employers, and nonprofits to increase the supply of workforce housing. A number of participants in the workforce housing survey expressed interest in working towards partnership-oriented solutions for employee housing, and of course, Revelstoke Resort is undertaking employee and workforce housing as well. Exploring the use of rental-only tenures to support workforce housing objectives, particularly when it comes to either existing rental or new market rental. And considering the implementation of a bylaw to establish an employer's charges for municipal employee housing services. Priority number 3 looks at regulation and protection of rental and mobile homes. So establishing regulations to protect tenants and existing purpose-built stock, developing and implementing mobile home protection policies, and developing, or I guess it should say now, finalizing and implementing short-term vacation rental regulations that balance the need for short and long-term rental accommodation. Priority strategy number 4 is increasing opportunities for affordable homeownership. So this is building on some of the language directly out of USP as well, which includes rezoning for comprehensive development proposals, will include a diversity of denser housing forms, which we know are less expensive than single-family homes. Rezoning should prioritize small lot unit size to promote more affordable options. Explore the expansion of gentle density options across all single-family homes in Revelstoke. And this is another avenue of entry for the land economics review that we're undertaking. So we'll be able to kind of flesh that out. And exploring opportunities to partner with the development community and BC Housing around the affordable homeownership program, which is delivered through BC Housing's Housing Hub. And then finally, priority strategy number 5 is the communication, education, and advocacy component of this. So the main action is to continue to advocate the senior levels of government for greater resource investment in homelessness and workforce housing in particular. Homelessness has, as noted, vulnerable populations haven't been particularly well served by BC Housing to date, but with new programs and partnership with Community Connections, there's an opportunity for greater advocacy around the need for supporting or very affordable housing, as well as, we are aware that one of the challenging gaps in BC Housing's current funding program is workforce housing, because of the way that they've structured their community housing fund program. But there are opportunities to kind of partner with them, particularly when they're willing partners and implementers in the community. And then second is communicating the need for greater density and diversity of housing to achieve affordable housing. So that brings me to just the last slide I've got here. Where do we go from here? I'm very much looking forward to comments and questions from council today. But our next steps are to complete the economic analysis that we have started. We have preliminary findings for. We are in the process of finalizing what we heard report, which will then also be put on the Let's Talk Revelstoke webpage. We'll work towards our kind of last opportunity and check in with stakeholders for engagement, and then finalize the draft and bring it back in front of council later in the summer, in June or potentially early July. So thank you very much for your time, and we'll move on to questions and comments.
Thanks, Matt. Appreciate it. Council, any questions or comments at this point? Councilor Ryan.
Yeah, thank you so much for the presentation. It's really great to see this work come forward, and I'm sure there was lots of there was obviously a lot of engagement that was done with the various stakeholders. When some of those suggestions are outlined, it does seem like those are suggestions that you could apply to several communities, not necessarily specific to Revelstoke. So I'm curious what the implementation action steps and costs and timelines and all that will look like. And is that part of this deliverable, or is that the next phase?
Yeah, no, that is, we will be, I mean, a big part of the implementation work is resting on the land economics review that we're undertaking. So when it comes to the big moves, for example, we're not just going to say you should implement density bonusing. We will help support the development of kind of targets and costing for that. That is part of the work, and that was built into the work plan from early on. So we'll be able to flesh out some of the bigger ticket items in terms of the other implementation pieces. Some of them are currently more fleshed out than others. The work of that typically looks like working group meetings with community economic development planning internally at the city to kind of to flesh those out. But they will absolutely be in the document. There will be an actions that go along with each one of those numbered items that show how staff and community partners can implement each of the actions. It would just be a lot to get into in a council presentation. Kind of did that.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you.
Any other comments, questions, Councilor Sherlock?
Thank you, Worship, and yeah, thank you for the presentation. This is a big puzzle that we've been beating our heads against walls about for ages, it feels like, and it's going to be interesting to see it all come together into one place that looks at those complexities. You'd mentioned about some of the work that is ongoing with the city, so I'm assuming the final report will have those updated information about the zoning bylaw or short-term rentals bylaw, for example. I am curious, I've got a few things listed, but I'll start with measurements. One of the things we're seeing a lot from both the province, as you mentioned, having more investment, but also the federal government now talking about housing investments and ideas and what do we do? I'm curious as to any insight on what measurements should we be looking at to be able to align our work to access some of that grant funding?
At the provincial level, your primary tool as municipality remains the housing needs report, because that is now a legislative requirement. So
Sorry. The
housing needs report.
housing needs report. Yes, thank you.
Yeah. So one of the things that we actually did in our phase 1 report was update a few of the indicators that hadn't yet been released when the 2018 report was developed. So certainly kind of looking at 2021 census figures is a really important, especially core housing need by renter and owner is absolutely vital to understanding who is challenged in the community. One really important tool that it's important to be aware of as well is currently being developed by UBC. It's called the HART, Housing Action. Oh, sorry, I forget the acronym, but it will be an online platform that's due out early next year. That's actually going to break down by tenure, but also by population group, who is in core housing need, so that municipalities can better understand who is paying more than their 30% and who's really challenged within the housing sector. So that's going to come out and be available probably Q1 of next year. But generally speaking, yeah, the housing needs reports at the provincial level and staying up to date with those is key. I would suggest that for the city of Revelstoke, one area of advocacy is better rental market data from CMHC, because that is not currently publicly available. But we know that vacancy rates and the cost of median market rent or average market rent is absolutely one of the tools that they use to gauge projects and the viability of projects in communities. And speaking as somebody who lives in Gibson's, they don't trust the numbers that we collect, but they don't have any numbers for our community. It's a challenge working with them without that data. So I would suggest that that may be an area where advocacy could be a role, so that you can better align to federal priorities, because CMHC puts a lot of value on their housing market information portal, but it does not capture data from smaller and even some size communities. So,
Any questions, comments? Councilor Lee?
Yes, it's great information, and a lot of it is basically the supply has been restricted, and we've got no apartments and no replacement homes for seniors, and that's been known for quite some time. So there's not, but I'm just wondering whether municipal government should be focused on below market housing. Shouldn't our objective be just increase the supply, what market housing, just let the market dictate the price? We focus on the concrete elements, the actual buildings and getting them built and ensuring that they're getting, and incentivizing the type of housing we want, like rentals or seniors' homes or that sort. We find an incentive for it. But let the market. As soon as you start dabbling in the market as a government, we're moving in a different direction, more towards maybe a direction that I particularly say let the market figure out where it's going. If we encourage housing, that should be the solution. And then the market will dictate from that point on. Building below market as an intent, are we creating a problem? I mean, that's a philosophical discussion. Whether we get involved, the government gets involved in the housing game is a different story.
Any comment, Matt?
Yeah, I mean, I think that one of the challenges that we've seen is that the market doesn't tend to deliver lower or even low end of market housing without incentives or supports or intervention. I would not suggest that local government should be in the role of building or developing housing of any kind, regardless of whether it's non-market or market. But the reality is that I think that the primary intervention in the market should come from senior government in the form of capital investment for BC housing. But if we're talking realistically, every community wants an investment from BC housing, and looking at ways to attract that investment is where the role of incentives and land contributions come in. Now, that being said, I think some of the best models that we see for housing out there tend to be mixed market. That is some market level, some non-market, some deeply subsidized. And that's how BC Housing was constructed their community housing fund. But in order to be able to attract that highly competitive funding source, it's important that municipalities are seen as coming to the table as partners. And that's, that is the messaging that we hear from BC Housing. And to a lesser extent, CMHC as well.
Yeah, my argument is that we should be going, the moment we start going to the federal and provincial government for funding to build housing, it's going to be a long road. It's going to be a long time coming. It's just a slow process. What we've seen here is particularly slow. But I'm just saying, if we can go directly to the developers and the builders and the guys on the ground and say, listen, we need rental accommodation. We'll find an incentive for you. Let's get going. And these guys, just be clear about what we want, encourage the people locally and people who invested and know what they're doing to get it done. And that's that. If we're clear, then things will happen. But if we start going out and looking for handouts, looking for other things to come to us, it just gets very slow and tedious.
Yeah, I mean, I would not absolutely not argue that working with senior government in this process. And I do think that there's a big role for the private sector in delivering the kind of housing we're talking about, particularly workforce, but there are some forms of housing, deeply subsidized housing, support housing, that will never be delivered by the private market. And I do think there's a role for local government in supporting or facilitating that development as well as going after the quick to act development or developer oriented funding. I mean, right now there's a huge need for both deep subsidy and workforce housing within Revelstoke. And I don't think it's an either or. I think that there are opportunities to kind of address both, knowing that one may be a faster solution and another may involve going hand in hand with government over a longer period of time.
Any other questions or comments, Council? Councilor Sheehan.
I'll just make a quick comment about this idea of partnering. I think I really appreciate the idea of paying attention where money comes from and where it goes. So when we talk about using the Affordable Housing Reserve to cover the DCC rebates, for example, so that way the development portion is being paid by the development, whether the community, the reserve pays for it or the developer pays for it. This is a way that we can incentivize, but without taking those funds out of the DCC funds and therefore putting on the backs of the average taxpayer that's already paying more. So I appreciate how that starts fitting the puzzle in a bit more of a complex way that addresses those concerns. And I agree on the workforce housing. There is such a challenge there. I'm looking forward. I like the idea of number 5 in the priorities when we're looking at communications, education, and advocacy, and working with our partners. So whether that's our regional partners with the CSRD, because I know we're facing similar challenges outside of our community, and especially with the fact that Malacqua is turning into a Revelstoke bedroom community. We should be having a conversation about that. I know a lot of people that commute for that work because it is more affordable. They're commuting from Sycamoose, for goodness sake. There's a lot here that I'd love to dig into, but I appreciate that there is more to come, especially when it looks at the rentals, There was one I will actually ask a quick question on the priority number 2, item 4, consider the implementation of a bylaw to establish and impose charges for municipal employee housing services. What does that refer to?
Great question. So this is based on the resort municipalities being allowed to implement this bylaw. And it's one that Whistler has in place that is essentially a service charge for municipal employee housing services. I have to admit that this is one that was recommended by my colleague Nancy Henderson, who's been supporting the OCP work based on her experience in Whistler. So I would probably refer that question back to her as she kind of understands things a little bit better. So I think we could get back to you on more detail on that.
Yeah, I'm curious to see where that goes. I think the challenges that a resort municipality does face, I mean, I remember going to the Chamber and BC, Destination BC, asking what the industry was going to do about the fact that most of the staff in the industry cannot afford to live in our towns. And when I asked the industry about it, they say it's not their job to make affordable housing for their employees, that they are paying wage that can't afford to live in our community. So we keep getting stuck on, well, it's not my job, it's your job, it's not my job, it's your job. And finding ways to at least put it all into one document that we can start looking at aligning on these goals to make this work happen. I think it's going to be interesting to see where it goes. The existing housing conditions, I think, is going to be a big puzzle that Revelstoke really needs to look at. A lot of our so-called affordable housing, which I hope is going to get defined in the strategy, because affordable has 20 different ways to define it. The existing housing stock and the condition of it and the idea of energy poverty, where we were talking before about how do we incentivize improving that stock so that sure, your rent might be low, but if your heat is $400 a month, that's throwing all the numbers out of whack. My last question outside of the comments, because I happily disagree with you, Councillor Elliott, and I know we butt heads on this a lot, where I do think it is the local government's role to play some kind of a strategic role in affordable housing.
I would say that as long as you clear up the regulations and allow things, pick your target.
Right,
You want,
yeah.
you want an apartment, let's go out and encourage someone to build an apartment.
And I think
Before go to the BCC.
I think we have different viewpoints on it, which is, that's the beauty of having different viewpoints at the table, to have these conversations. But the one last question, you'd mentioned about advocacy to CMHC. Where would we best put that advocacy effort?
Yeah, I think that there are a couple of opportunities. There are both local resources that are staff members of CMHC that would be kind of an avenue from a staff to staff perspective. But I also think there's a political advocacy role through an MP as well as the Minister of Housing.
And that's
Yeah. Through the Minister of Housing to consider more opportunities for small community data collection, but also what is the reality is that CMHC is not invested as much in UMBC as it has in other parts of the country, and I think through organizations like UMBC, there are opportunities to kind of raise advocacy issues as well towards the federal level.
Thank you. All right. Thank you, Matt. Appreciate the presentation. We look forward to the engagement process as it goes back out again and then coming back to council. Thanks for your time. Appreciate all your work.
Thank you very much, Mayor Council.
Okay, we are going to move on to Parks, Rec, and Culture, Revelstoke Forum. Someone want to put the motion on the table and we can communicate with Ms. Donato regarding this. Councilor Brooks.
That council provide authorization for the Revelstoke Grizzlies Hockey Society to apply for a permanent liquor primary license, event driven, as the primary license holder for the Revelstoke Forum, and that all costs associated with the application process and annual licensing fees be borne by the Revelstoke Grizzlies Hockey Society.
Seconded for the motion, Councilor Ryan. Discussion on the motion. Do you have any questions for Ms. Donato? I think the report is pretty self-explanatory. I'm appreciative of that. So, Ms. Donato, any concerns that you have at this point?
Thank you, Your Worship. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay, thanks. No concerns at the moment. A lot of different scenarios can be negotiated through the facility use agreement. So we would just need to have a robust agreement, just making sure that we have certain requirements stipulated in that agreement.
I appreciate that. I think, what you're doing down there and trying to assist these people to get to something that actually will work for them and work for the community and limit liability to the community is very important. So, I don't know, any other questions or concerns from council? Councilor Chalette?
First, I really appreciate the report. Especially getting into the risk implications, having done the lease at the golf course myself, operating my own lease with liquor service in amongst a nonprofit membership that was separate. It gets complicated real quick. I'd be in support of option number 1, where we would authorize Revelstoke Grizzlies Hockey Society and make an application for the permanent as the primary license holder. I think that taking on further liability as the city would be adding additional workload for the oversight without a huge amount of benefit. I think you've listed out the cons well, Ms. Donato, talking about how if it is run poorly, it would reflect negatively on us. But getting into the can of worms that is liquor service liability and taking care of that properly, I think is something I would rather not touch with a 10-foot pole as a city.
Great, thank you. Councilor Rowan.
If we make them the primary license holder, how difficult is it to revoke that access?
Ms. Donato, any comment? Can we revoke anything, or is that something done under the liquor control people?
Your worship, I would have to get some legal advice in terms of the wording that we would have to use in the facility use agreement. As well, I would probably have a conversation with a liquor, just a representative of the liquor and cannabis branch, just to have further conversation on what that would look like.
Because I think that as long as there's wording in the contract that would make it reasonable for us to I don't know, not withhold access, but I mean, I guess at the end of the day, it's the city's building. So if it was really poorly managed, you could just like revoke other access. But if it was properly worded in the contract, I agree with Councillor Gillette that the primary license holder is the best, looks like the best option.
Yeah. Any other comments from council? Okay, I'll call the question. All those in favor? Opposed? Motion's carried. Ms. Donato, thank you. Appreciate your report.
Thank you, your worship.
All right, moving on to communications, finance committee.
Yeah, I made the motion.
Sorry, my brain's.
Yeah, okay. Good. Finance committee meeting minutes of March 31st. Any comments? Seeing none. Ms. Rousseau, Ms. Floyd, any questions from the press?
No, your worship, there aren't.
Okay, so I would like to get someone to make a motion to go in camera pursuant to section 90.1K of the community charter. Councillor Ryan, signed by Councillor Gillette. All in favor? Motion's carried. We will go in camera. Do I need to go to a different